We configured the latest AI models to think like philosophical, political, and financial experts to help us answer, is democracy really it? We have broken down the debate into rounds or points if you'd rather, first one being stability and governance.
Let me be honest with you. When we talk about stability and governance, I truly believe authoritarian systems in certain contexts provide something democracy often struggles to: swift, decisive action. People want safety, security, and order in their lives. They fear chaos, gridlock, and the uncertainty that comes with indecision. And let's face it, democracy, with all its virtues, can sometimes paralyze itself. Take the Weimar Republic in Germany after World War I. It was a democracy, yes, but it was also riddled with instability. Political factions tore the system apart, while people suffered from hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and violent street clashes. Democracy allowed extremist voices to thrive because there was no strong, unified leadership to pull the country out of the chaos. Now imagine if a more centralized, authoritarian figure had been in place earlier. Someone who could enforce swift economic and social reforms without needing to win over divided parliaments. The rise of extremism might never have happened. Or look at modern democracies today. The US Congress often finds itself in political deadlocks, unable to pass critical legislation on healthcare, gun control, or even basic budgeting. How does that feel for people living paycheck to paycheck, waiting for relief while politicians bicker? Compare this with China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. They locked down entire cities in days, built hospitals in weeks, and contained the virus far faster than many democratic nations. Yes, there were trade-offs, but the results were undeniable. They saved lives and kept their economy intact, while other nations struggled under the weight of slow-moving democratic processes. Political theorists like Carl Schmitt argued that during times of crisis, a nation's survival depends on a strong, decisive leader, not endless debate. And isn't that what we crave deep down during times of uncertainty? Stability, control. A leader who can shield us from the storm, even if it means sacrificing some freedoms temporarily. Now, of course, people will criticize this idea, saying authoritarian systems are oppressive. But let me ask, how often do democracies enforce policies we don't like under the guise of the greater good? Think of mass surveillance programs like the NSA's PRISM, which was revealed by Edward Snowden. We live under a double standard. Democracies quietly erode freedoms while criticizing authoritarian systems for doing the same, but openly. When you weigh it all, the need for order, the fear of chaos, the desire for decisive action, authoritarian governance, in specific situations, becomes not just preferable but necessary. It's uncomfortable to admit, but history shows us that in times of crisis, people gravitate toward leaders who act, not just debate. Look, I understand the appeal of authoritarianism. It promises stability, quick decision-making, and the illusion that one strong leader can steer the ship during a storm. But let me tell you why democracy, not authoritarianism, is the better path, especially if we care about true, lasting stability. When power is concentrated in one person or a small group, it creates a fragile system, one that might seem strong but can shatter when things go wrong. Take Nazi Germany. Hitler's centralized control allowed for swift decision-making, sure, but it also meant his unchecked paranoia and catastrophic military ambitions led the country to ruin. There were no brakes on his power, no way for the people or institutions to correct course. Millions suffered because no one could stand up and say, "This is wrong." Democracy, for all its messiness, has built-in mechanisms to avoid that kind of disaster. It allows for checks and balances, for dissenting voices to challenge bad decisions before they spiral out of control. Think about the US during the Watergate scandal. When a president abused his power, democratic institutions, the press, the judiciary, even Congress, stood up to him. Nixon resigned not because one person decided it, but because the system demanded accountability. And authoritarianism isn't even as stable as it pretends to be. Look at modern Russia. Yes, Putin maintains tight control, but the cracks are showing. Economic stagnation, widespread corruption, and growing dissent. People want security and fairness, but what they get is repression disguised as stability. Democracies, on the other hand, adapt. Yes, they're slower, but that slowness is resilience. It's a system that bends instead of breaking. And let's talk about human dignity. Do you want to live in a society where your voice doesn't matter? Where fear controls you? Because that's the reality of authoritarianism. Democracies give us something priceless, the ability to hold our leaders accountable, to have a say in the direction of our lives. That's why Václav Havel, a dissident who fought authoritarian rule, said, "The salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the human heart." People often criticize democracy for being chaotic or inefficient. But let's be real. How many authoritarian regimes sacrifice their people's freedoms while claiming it's for the greater good? Mass surveillance in democracies gets exposed and debated. In authoritarian states, it's just a fact of life with no recourse. Democracy isn't perfect. It's messy, loud, and sometimes painfully slow. But it respects human dignity, allows us to correct mistakes, and gives us a voice. And in the long run, that's the only real stability, one built on the trust and participation of the people. Let me ask you this. What is it that drives real lasting prosperity? Is it the blind obedience demanded by authoritarian regimes? Or is it the freedom to dream, innovate, and compete in a system where people have a voice? I firmly believe it's the latter, and history proves it. Take Italy in the early 20th century. Benito Mussolini's authoritarian rule promised economic revitalization. At first, it seemed to work. He modernized railroads and made the trains run on time, a point his supporters were quick to celebrate. But beneath the surface, his centralized economic policies stifled competition and innovation. Private industries were forced to align with state interests, choking entrepreneurial spirit. By the 1930s, Italy's economy was floundering under the weight of inefficient state control, while democratic nations like the United States, reeling from the Great Depression, were already laying the groundwork for a vibrant post-war economy. Now, consider this. What really motivates people to innovate and work harder? It's the promise that their effort will be rewarded. In a democracy, your hard work isn't at the mercy of a dictator's whims. You know your ideas, your inventions, your businesses are protected. That's why Silicon Valley exists in a democracy like the United States and not in an authoritarian state. I think about what it would feel like to live in an authoritarian system. Yes, there's order, but at what cost? Your fears are weaponized. The fear of speaking out, of failing in an economy where the state decides which industries succeed or fail. That's not growth. That's oppression wrapped in an illusion of progress. Look at the Soviet Union. For decades, the centralized command economy tried to outpace the free markets of democratic countries. Sure, they produced tanks and missiles, but when it came to feeding their people or creating world-changing innovations, they fell flat. Compare that to democratic post-war Japan. Japan, devastated in 1945, rose to become an economic powerhouse within decades because democracy gave people the freedom to rebuild, innovate, and thrive. And let's not forget, economic growth isn't just about numbers on a chart. It's about the quality of life for everyday people. In democracies, you're less likely to face forced labor, state-mandated job placements, or policies that prioritize the economy over your humanity. Remember the Great Leap Forward in China? Millions died from famine because the authoritarian regime valued industrial output over human lives. Economic growth isn't just about GDP, it's about dignity. It's about knowing that the wealth you create benefits your family, not just some faceless regime. Democracies might be messy, but they protect this principle. They give people the space to pursue their desires and safeguard against the pain of having those dreams crushed by unchecked power. So tell me, would you rather live in a system where you know your effort matters and your voice is heard, or one where your fears are used to silence you, even at the cost of the society's future? History has shown us time and again. Democracy, for all its flaws, fosters not just economic growth but human growth. And isn't that the point of progress? Let me ask you something. When the stakes are high and the clock is ticking, what matters more? Endless debates or decisive action? I know what I'd choose. History has shown us that there are moments when strong, centralized leadership is not just preferable but necessary for economic growth. Take post-1949 China as an example. The country was in shambles after years of civil war and foreign occupation. In the early years of the People's Republic, authoritarian control allowed sweeping land reforms, massive infrastructure projects, and industrialization at a pace no democracy could have managed. Later, Deng Xiaoping's reforms in the 1980s, still under an authoritarian system, transformed China into the world's second largest economy. Imagine if China had been a democracy back then. The fragmented decision-making process would likely have delayed or diluted those critical reforms. People wanted results, not endless debates, and that's what they got. Now compare that to India during the same period. As a democracy, India had the freedom to argue and deliberate, and it did. But while debates raged in parliament, the country struggled with sluggish growth for decades. Bureaucratic inefficiency and political infighting slowed down progress, leaving millions in poverty. In contrast, China's authoritarian system pulled hundreds of millions out of poverty in a single generation. That's not just growth, that's transformation. And think about it on a more personal level. When you're struggling to make ends meet, do you care how the roads, schools, or industries get built? Or do you just want them built? In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew's authoritarian leadership prioritized economic development over political freedoms. The result? A tiny island nation became a global financial hub in just a few decades. If Singapore had been a democracy back then, do you think it could have achieved the same results so quickly? People's desires for economic stability outweighed their concerns about political liberties, and for good reason. But let's not ignore the fears and pains people have. I know some worry about the potential abuse of power in authoritarian systems. That's fair. But what about the fear of chaos in democracies? Imagine living in a country where nothing gets done because politicians can't agree, where infrastructure crumbles because every project becomes a battleground for competing interests. Just look at the Weimar Republic in Germany during the 1920s. Its democratic system was so paralyzed by political infighting that it couldn't address the economic crisis, paving the way for Hitler's rise. While his rule brought horrors we should never forget, it also serves as a reminder of how a failing democracy can lead to even worse outcomes. And let's be honest, most people care more about putting food on the table than the finer points of political philosophy. In authoritarian systems, leaders can focus on long-term economic strategies without worrying about re-election. That's how the Gulf states turned oil wealth into rapid modernization. Would democracies have been able to achieve such focused top-down development in the same time frame? I'm not saying authoritarianism is perfect, no system is. But in times of crisis, or when rapid growth is essential, it often delivers results that democracies can only dream of. When people's fears are rooted in poverty, unemployment, or instability, they don't want more voices in the room. They want someone to take charge and fix the problem. And sometimes that's exactly what an authoritarian system does. Let's be honest, freedom is a beautiful idea, but there's a limit to how much chaos a society can handle in the name of freedom. I know we all want our voices heard, our desires met, and our pains acknowledged, but what happens when too many voices clash, when decision-making stalls, and when progress grinds to a halt? Sometimes, too much freedom leaves us paralyzed, tearing ourselves apart over endless debates instead of acting decisively. Think about the Weimar Republic in Germany after World War I. It was a democracy, and on paper, it should have worked. Everyone had a say, elections were held, and freedom was abundant. But that abundance turned into disarray. Extremists rose to power, the economy collapsed, and people were left desperate and leaderless. The lack of strong, centralized control allowed chaos to fester until something far worse took its place. Do you really want to risk living in a society where indecision and infighting pave the way for ruin? Now let's look at a different story, Singapore. It's an authoritarian system, and yet its people enjoy a level of prosperity and safety that many democracies envy. The government took hard, sometimes unpopular decisions to build housing, create jobs, and reduce crime. They didn't have to appease every opposing opinion to get things done. Instead, they acted with clarity and purpose. And today, Singapore is one of the safest, most advanced nations in the world. I can already hear the critics saying, but that's not freedom. Let me ask you this. What's freedom worth if your streets aren't safe or your future feels uncertain? Look at the United States today. Its democracy is a beacon of freedom, yet it struggles with mass shootings, divisive politics, and a lack of trust in leadership. People live in fear of violence and instability, despite having the freedom to vote and speak their minds. Isn't that a double standard? An authoritarian system isn't about silencing everyone, it's about creating order and focus. Take China as an example. While Western democracies were tangled in debates over how to respond to COVID-19, China implemented swift, decisive measures. The result? They contained the virus far faster and avoided the prolonged suffering that democratic indecision caused in places like the United States and Italy. Sure, the restrictions were strict, but they saved lives and got the job done. Isn't that the kind of leadership we want in a crisis? And let's not forget, democracy often isn't as free as it claims to be. Think about how surveillance programs in democratic nations monitor our every move under the guise of security. Isn't that just authoritarianism in disguise? At least under a transparent authoritarian system, you know the rules and you understand the trade-offs. I know this sounds harsh, but ask yourself this. Would you rather live in a society that promises you absolute freedom but leaves you vulnerable to chaos and stagnation, or one that limits some freedoms to give you stability, progress, and safety? Authoritarianism isn't about crushing people, it's about ensuring the ship sails smoothly, even if the captain has to tighten the reins sometimes. And in a world as uncertain as ours, isn't that what we need? Opposition, individual freedoms and rights. Listen, let me ask you something. What is life without freedom? What's the point of stability or growth if you have no say in how your life is governed? Under a democracy, you're not just a subject, you're a participant. You have the right to speak out, to challenge authority, and to make choices that shape your future. That's the essence of humanity, agency. Now let's imagine a world where you don't have that freedom. Think of Mussolini's Italy in the early 20th century. Sure, the trains ran on time, but at what cost? Dissenters were silenced, often violently. People lived in fear of speaking out, knowing the regime's spies were always listening. Families were torn apart because questioning the state was considered treason. It wasn't stability, it was suffocation. Could you live like that? Knowing your thoughts, your words, even your whispers, could lead to imprisonment, or worse. Contrast that with democracies like post-apartheid South Africa. After decades of oppression, Nelson Mandela didn't consolidate power for stability. Instead, he embraced democracy, giving even his former oppressors a voice in rebuilding the nation. That's what democracy offers, the chance to heal, to grow, and to hold power accountable. And yes, I get it. Democracy isn't perfect. It's messy, slow, even frustrating. But that mess is the sound of freedom. It's people debating, challenging, and fighting for what they believe in, without fear of disappearing into the night. Under an authoritarian regime, that mess is replaced by silence. Not peace, silence. Think about the Soviet Union. People were promised equality and progress under the iron fist of centralized control. Instead, they got fear, famine, and gulags. Imagine living in a world where questioning why there's no bread on the shelves could cost you your life. That's the trade-off with authoritarianism. You give up your voice in exchange for an illusion of control. But in a democracy, even when things go wrong, you have hope. You can vote for change. You can march in the streets. You can speak your truth without the knock on the door at 3 a.m. And if you've ever taken that for granted, remember this. Millions of people around the world are still fighting for the freedoms you might consider normal. It comes down to this. Do you want a life where you're heard, where your pain matters, where your beliefs have a chance to shape your society? Or do you want a life where your desires, your fears, and even your joys are dictated by someone else's whim? Democracy isn't just a system, it's the embodiment of hope. And that hope is worth fighting for, no matter how messy it gets.
After the three main points discussed, we can only be left with the questions, which one do you think is better? Subscribe if you liked the video, and see you on the next one.